Hello and welcome to all of you. This is the second of the three lectures that I am to deliver on the text The Shroud by Munshi Premchand. The title of today's lecture is Premchand's The Shroud, A Tale of Feudal Wounds. In the previous class, we discussed about Premchand's life and works and his place in Hindi-Urdu literature or Urdu-Hindi literature in India. And consequently, the relation between these two languages were discussed, and then the major themes of Munshi Premchand's works were pointed out, and finally I delved into the story of the text while I quoted some lines from both the Hindi and the translated version. So, in today's class, we are going to focus on the wounds, the feudal wounds that are carved by the feudal structure of Premchand's time. And we will try to see how Premchand negotiates the issues of class, caste, gender in the story to expose those feudal wounds, and by doing that, how he aims towards a better, reformed society. And then we will contrast Premchand's pessimism with Gandhian idealism. And finally, we'll look into some key moments or key scenes of the story. So, it is essential that we have some understanding on Indian feudalism. We all know something about Indian feudalism, which originated during the 4th century AD, when the Gupta dynasty was in power. Indian feudalism, the system was introduced by the kings and the rulers of that time to introduce a decentralized order of governance, because it was becoming very difficult for them to control the vast territories that they had. So what they did, they started donating lands to the Brahmins, official and the military commanders. Now, these land grants not only transferred the revenue rights, it also transferred the judicial and the administrative power. This new system reshaped the agrarian economy of India and its social hierarchy and the governance systems. Because who were these people who received lands from the kings and the rulers? They were the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas, the top two categories of Varnashrama, who already belonged to the upper rungs of the society in terms of economy, rights and power. And after becoming the landowner, they became the absolute authority in an agrarian setup. And the lower caste people, they became more powerless and landless. So basically, this feudalism reinforced caste-based hierarchy with Brahmins and Kshatriyas as the land-holding elites, while the laborers, the peasantry, they became a dependent and exploited class of bonded labor. And as you know, as India went through different dynasties, the Rajput period, the Delhi Sultanate, this feudal structure continued to evolve. And finally, during the Mughal period, especially under Akbar, this feudal structure started to collapse because of the centralized administration run by the Mughal emperor. And in the British colonial period, due to the different settlements introduced by the British, like the permanent settlement, the Rayatwadi settlement, the Mahalwadi settlement. Due to the introduction of these settlements, the feudalism, the feudal structure started to collapse, and finally it ended. But the residue, the wounds of that feudal structure were still there in an agrarian setting when Premchand was writing. The colonial economy did not erase the feudal structure, the feudal hierarchies. It often repurposed them, leaving the essential power dynamic between the landowner and the landless laborer painfully intact. And in the story The Shroud, we encounter these feudal wounds in their most raw, unadorned, and post-historic form. So, the story Coffin or The Shroud, it is not about feudalism in its classical functioning sense, but about its aftermath, the human debris left behind after centuries of systemic deprivation. So now we will talk about the feudal wounds as we see in this story The Shroud. First, we will talk about the social wound of feudalism in The Shroud. The story is about Ghisu, Madhav and Budhiya. Ghisu and Madhav, the father and son, they belong to a lower caste Chamar family. And as I discussed in the first class, they are very lazy. They have apathy towards any kind of physical work, and their condition, they are very poor. So, but the other lower caste people in the village who toil day and night to make ends meet, their condition is not much very different from Ghisu and Madhav. And here is the Premchand's very crucial and devastating point. The system is so rigged that the differential between an active poor and an inactive poor is negligible. And the reward for hard work is merely a slightly deferred starvation. I quote from the text: "A society in which those who labored night and day were not in much better shape than these two. A society in which, compared to the peasants, those who knew how to exploit the peasants' weaknesses were much better off." So this is the social wound I was talking about, the social wound of feudalism, where a person who is born in a lower caste family is destined to be the most neglected, most hated, most exploited, and most hopelessly helpless, however she or he might try to overcome the situation. And Ghisu and Madhav they seem to have internalized the futility of the struggle. Why work when that only enriches the rich? So Premchand is trying to say that the idleness of Ghisu and Madhav is not laziness. It is a learned outcome of structural alienation and dehumanization. Maybe it's Ghisu and Madhav's way of resisting feudal oppression through subversion. Feudalism festers through other wounds too. One of them is the economic wound. So now we'll try to look into the economic wound in the story The Shroud. In a village, the landlord holds the economic power. We see in the story that the economic dependency is so complete that even the charity for the shroud for dead Budhiya comes from the landlord. The charity, ironically, reinforces the social structure, the social hierarchy, the power hierarchy. The landlord gives the money, the peasants show gratitude, and the system remains intact. The rich feel noble, and the poor, they trapped in. They remain trapped. So this transaction between Ghisu and Madhav and the landlord, it is a microcosm of feudal economics. The landlord's 2 rupees gift, this is 2 rupees are not a gift, but it is a reinvestment in the social order. It is a small price to maintain the narrative of benevolent paternalism, a narrative that absolves the landlord of any responsibility of his responsibility for the structural conditions that led to Budhia's death and the family's destitution. When in the opening scene we see that Budhia is writhing in pain inside the heart, we only hear her cries of pain. At the same time, we see that Ghisu and Madhav, they are sitting outside, they are eating boiled potatoes, and they are chit-chatting, and at the same time, Ghisu is reminiscing about good food that he had many years back at a Thakur's wedding. So Ghisu and Madhav's shocking indifference, it is not just inhumanity, but it's a result of habitual and structural suffering due to social stigma and economic degradation. And the memory of landlord's feast is not a casual anecdote. It is a haunting symbol of a world of plenty from which Ghisu and Madhav are excluded, are permanently excluded. And their conversation about fine foods like, I quote, puris, kachuris, halwa, Sohan halwa, while Budhia groans inside, is a masterpiece of tragic irony. People like Ghisu and Madhav are thus dehumanized. When Budhia's death is revealed, we see that Madhav and Ghisu cannot mourn properly. I quote from the text again. But this wasn't the occasion for an excessive show of grief. They had to worry about the shroud and the wood. Money was as scarce in their house as meat in a raptor's nest. Father and son went weeping to the village landlord. I unquote. So, in a world where grief has no economic value, even mourning becomes a luxury. So, their tears as they go to the landlord are a mere performance. It is performative, a currency to exchange for rupees. So here we see how authentic human emotion has been instrumentalized and commodified by sheer need. So now we'll talk about another very important wound of feudalism, the symbolic wound. The title of the story is The Shroud. You know, the shroud is an object. It's I told you earlier that it's white scented cloth. So the shroud itself becomes a bitter metaphor in the story. A shroud is meant to preserve dignity in the dead, dignity in death. Hence, in the story, we see that social dignity is so scarce that even death cannot guarantee it. And ironically, only in death the society mandates the marginalized to dignify their dead, while having no say whatsoever at the structural inequality that dehumanizes them, that alienates them even from mourning. And Ghisu knows that while going to the bazaar for buying shroud, he seems to mutter in a helpless protest, I quote, "What a bad custom it is that someone who didn't even get a rag to cover her body when she was alive needs a new shroud when she is dead. After all, the shroud burns along with the body." So here it is a moment of class consciousness where Ghisu sees through the absurdity of a ritual that benefits no one, not the living, not the dead. But this ritual merely serves to uphold a societal norm designed by and for those who can afford its symbolism. So, these are the various wounds of feudalism that we encounter in the story The Shroud by Munshi Premchand. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that Premchand is considered to be the master of realist fiction. He excels at depicting reformist realism. Now, what is reformist realism? Reformist realism is a technique of depicting harsh, hard-hitting reality, which aims at altering the moral equilibrium and the social order through evoking readers' guilty conscience. And it operates on the belief that to represent the truth, however ugly it might be, is the first step towards demanding change. The reader who is comfortably distant is made an unwilling witness, and their discomfort is the engine engine of potential reform. And the story The Shroud is a brilliant example of such reformist realism. Here we see that Premchand masterfully uses pessimism blended with dark humor and irony to arouse the reader's sympathy. And by doing so, Premchand sets himself in stark contrast with Gandhian idealism. So, as we all know, Mahatma Gandhiji's idealism is based on the principles of truth and non-violence. It advocates for practical, ethical living to achieve individual and societal transformation. And it focuses on self-sufficiency, Swadeshi, universal uplift, Sarvodaya, and soul force, Satyagraha, to combat injustice without harming others. And this Gandhian philosophy is deeply rooted in the Indian spiritual tradition, and it has influenced global movements for peace and freedom. So now let's contrast Gandhian idealism with Premchand's pessimism. In Gandhian vision, the focus is on the moral upliftment of the poor. It perceives village as a site of purity and harmony, and at the same time it believes in the inner goodness of the marginalized, and ultimately it aims at transformation through ethical reform and self-discipline and non-violence. While in Premchand's vision, the village is not so pure. It is a site of exploitation, caste struggle, and cruelty. It believes that poverty corrodes not only the body but also the soul. It also believes that the suffering does not always ennoble, sometimes it degrades. And that is why ethical reform cannot exist without the structural reform. And we see that in the story The Shroud, Premchand almost directly challenges this Gandhian idealism, the Gandhian faith in moral regeneration. Ghisu and Madhav, they are not ideal poor. They are not honest, striving, or spiritually rich in their poverty. And they do not respond to their suffering with elevated ethics. Instead, they respond to their suffering with numbness. Premchand is not pessimistic because he believes that humans are bad. He is pessimistic because the system leaves them no room to be good. And in the final scene, where we see that Ghisu and Madhav are drinking away the shroud money, this scene is the antithesis of Gandhian self-restraint and duty. It is an embrace of momentary oblivion over societal duty, a choice that makes Ghisu and Madhav morally reprehensible from a Gandhian point of view, but tragically understandable from the point of view of Munshi Premchand. And this ideological tension between Gandhian vision and Premchand's vision, it reveals a historically important debate in Indian thought. Should we reform society through moral ideals or through material change? And in the story The Shroud, Premchand clearly chooses the latter. Premchand's work suggests that you must first alter the material conditions, the land ownership, the economic exploitation, the caste oppression, before you can expect any genuine moral transformation. So now let's focus on some of the key moments, key scenes of the story, The Shroud. And we'll try to analyze those scenes, and we'll try to understand what Premchand is trying to say to his readers. We'll try to dig up the inner meanings of the scenes. Let's discuss the opening scene first. In the opening scene, what we see that Budhia is dying inside the hut while giving birth to the child, and Ghisu and Madhav, they are sitting outside, and they are not very concerned about Budhia's pain, and they are enjoying their food, and they are talking to each other, and finally they go to sleep. So the first image of the story is that Budhia is thrashing about in pain inside the hut, while Ghisu and Madhav, they are sitting outside beside a fire, by a fire. So this first image sets the tone of the story. Poverty is not romantic, it's very brutal. And Ghisu and Madhav's laughter, their casual banter, the fire, all contrast with Budhia's labor pain inside the hut. Premchand here uses irony to show emotional dislocation caused by chronic misery. The fire around which Ghisu and Madhav huddle is a focal point of warmth and community for them, but it is starkly separated from the dark, cold space of childbirth and death. So this physical separation mirrors their emotional and moral separation from Budhia's suffering. So this is the opening scene. Now let's focus on the death scene of Budhia. In the story, we never see Budhia. We only hear her cries of pain. And the narrative never dramatizes Budhia's suffering, it only states it. And this minimalism intensifies the tragedy of the story. By denying Budhia a face, a voice, Premchand does not diminish her, rather he universalizes her. Budhia becomes every marginalized woman whose suffering is unseen, unheard backdrop to the drama of survival. And we see that Budhia's death is treated by the men as inconvenience. Madhav at one point says, I quote, "If she dies, let her die." So Premchand here forces his readers, he forces us to see, to confront a world where death is a routine, where the loss of a life, especially a poor, lower caste woman's life, is not a catastrophe, but it is a predictable event in the cycle of deprivation. Budhia's death is not a plot twist, it is the inevitable conclusion of the story's first sentence. And now let's focus on another key moment of the story, the villagers' reaction and the landlord's charity. When Budhia dies, we see that the villagers gather around, attracted by loud wailing and chest beating of Ghisu and Madhav. And we see that the villagers criticize them, but they never question the system that produces such poverty. So, in a sense, the villagers' criticism is a form of social policing, focused on the performance of grief and duty rather than on the conditions that made Budhia's death inevitable. The villagers uphold the ritual, the need for a shroud. This is a ritual. They uphold the ritual without challenging the reality. This highlights how the community itself internalizes and perpetuates feudal values and thus becoming an agent of the very system that oppresses it. While Ghisu and Madhav go to the landlord for some financial help, we see that when Ghisu and Madhav go to the landlord for financial help, we see, I quote, that the landlord, quote, willingly or not, he pulled out 2 rupees and flung them down, but he did not open his lips to say a single word of consolation. He didn't even look in Ghisu's direction, as if he had discharged a duty. The verb flung is very important here. The money is not given, it's tossed, it's flung. It is an act which is devoid of any respect or human connection. So, charity here is a performance, not a solution. And now let's come to the final scene, the final drinking scene. The climax is very ironic because the shroud money becomes the liquor money. And we see that Ghisu and Madhav, they are celebrating while talking about Budhia's virtues. This moment captures the total destruction of emotional life under feudalism. In a perverse inversion of the funeral feast, they use the shroud money to fuel a celebration of their own temporary liberation from hunger and cold. And their drunken eulogies about Budhia, I quote, "She was a gem, there was no other woman like her." These eulogies ring hollow. At the same time, they contain a flicker of tragic recognition. In their intoxicated state, they can momentarily access a sentimental appreciation for the life they neglected, a sentiment that sobriety, burdened by survival, would not allow them. And Premchand ends with no hope and with no resolution. The final image of Ghisu and Madhav being drunk, spent, asleep offers no catharsis, no lesson learned, no path forward. And the system continues, and the wounded will continue to fester within it. Thus, in The Shroud, Premchand offers us one of the most powerful portrait of feudal wounds. Through reformist realism, he exposes how systemic poverty corrodes the body as well as the soul. His portrayal of Ghisu and Madhav is not an indictment of individual character but of a social order that makes ethical life impossible. And by contrasting with Gandhian idealism, Premchand seems to argue that genuine social reform requires more than moral uplift. It requires dismantling oppressive social structures. And thus, the story The Shroud remains a timeless reminder that poverty is not a moral failure, but it's a political one. And that literature can be a very powerful tool to expose those hidden wounds. The story The Shroud, it stands as an uncompromising mirror held up to the society, forcing the readers to see not just the plight of Ghisu and Madhav, but our own complicity in the systems that produce them. In its unflinching gaze, its ironic heart, and its profound humanity, Kafan or The Shroud secures Premchand's legacy not just as a chronicler of Indian life, but as one of its most acute and compassionate critics. So that is all for this class. In this class, we have discussed the feudal wounds of the story, and in the next class, we'll discuss the politics of caste, class, and gender in the story. So, see you in the next class. Thank you and goodbye.